Thanks, Meredith. And for those who are unaware of it, we do have some conference participants here. We are engaged in a 3-day conference on deliberative democracy, and this is the end of our first day. It's a very unusual conference. It's more like a workshop. And because it's on deliberative democracy, we're actually participating in a workshop using deliberative techniques. So we don't have any speakers, we don't have papers in the way that you would think of a traditional academic conference, and we're having a mighty fine time, I think. The conference is convened by the Centre for Citizenship and Public Policy, and that centre undertakes research that's focused on this field and related fields. And next year it'll be offering a professional course called Dialogue, Deliberation and Public Engagement, which is an award-winning course. If you have an interest in the topic, you'll have a chance to study it further. The centre itself is an excellent centre and committed to engage citizenship, and I wouldn't do this commercial if I didn't believe that to be true. The co-sponsor of the conference and this event is, as Meredith mentioned, the New Democracy Foundation, and it's the only foundation in Australia that's dedicated to putting people back into politics by funding activities that align with deliberative democracy, and it's very generously funded the Deliberative Democracy Conference, and the UWS has matched those funds. Another partner that wasn't mentioned is the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, and Meredith mentioned the International Association for Public Participation and the Deliberative Democracy Consortium in the US. I feel the need to say, what is this thing called deliberative democracy for those of you who are unaware of it? At the conference, we started to think we should just dump this phrase. It is so confusing and alienating, and maybe we've got the wrong phrase. So we'll be interested in hearing your response to that. But just by way of an introduction, I thought I should say that at present, and amongst academics, as you can imagine, there is no single universally accepted definition of deliberative democracy. However, there is substantial agreement amongst those who study and practice it that it's a form of democratic self-governance. And it's unusual in that it's about public decisions that are shaped through public dialogue and deliberation amongst citizens themselves, rather than solely through the adversarial debate between politicians, public officials, lobby groups and so on, with which you are mostly familiar, I suspect. And this democratic public deliberation requires, firstly, that citizens have an equal opportunity to participate in the process. That's reasonably difficult to achieve. Some of us play with random selection as a way of getting that equal opportunity, but there are other ways that you can do that. And it's incredibly important that those deliberative events are filled with information. You know, people who participate go away far more informed than they were at the start. And that's because there's a great deal of factual information and an opportunity to share experiences and exchange a wide range of viewpoints and arguments about an issue. So it's not all lovey-dovey, you know, there's a bit of debate and conflict in there that's to be encouraged. But it doesn't have that adversarial feel that you'd be familiar with in parliaments, for example. And it's very important with these public events or any sort of deliberative democracy that there's adequate time to actually talk about the issue or the problem that's under discussion. And even more important, that it be aided, or the group be aided, by experienced neutral facilitators that can help the group find its way to the resolution of its own challenges. So rather than just leaving a group to its own devices, a facilitator is always there to help the group find its way. And tonight's topic is why deliberative democracy matters, and we'll take that up now. I think the question is a very timely one when we're faced with the sort of complex challenges that surround us, and governments are struggling to meet those challenges alone, and I think governments are beginning to recognise that too. So the question is going to be taken up by what you see before you, a very distinguished panel. I'll share the chairing of the panel with Professor John Gastil from the University of Washington, who has published very widely on this topic and participated in a range of public deliberations. We'll be chairing it, but we're also going to join the conversation, mostly because we don't know how to shut up and we want to be able to have our say as well. We'll be speaking with Lars Kluver from the Danish Board of Technology in Denmark, Sandy Helerbacher from the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, which is based in the US, Matt Leighninger, who is the Executive Director of the Deliberative Democracy Consortium, and the Honourable Alannah Mactiernan, who's the former Minister for Planning and Infrastructure in Western Australia. And you'll hear more about each of those as we chat, but both they and the projects that they've been involved in are infinitely Googleable, as John Gastil said to me. I thought that was quite a nice phrase. So let me add that there were 60 researchers and practitioners at the conference that we began today, and any one of those 60 could be sitting on this stage now as part of this panel, telling fascinating stories about their work, and some of those have been told today in our midst. So I wish we could have had the whole 60 here, but it probably would have been extremely noisy, exciting but noisy. So now it's over to John Gastil to begin tonight's discussion.
Thank you for coming this evening. Just so we're clear, that applause was for Carson. I want to turn to Sandy Helerbacher, who created and has shepherded the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation for a decade. And the question I want to start you off with is, tell us a little bit about how that coalition has fared over the course of these years, and in particular, have you noticed any effect on the efficacy of your work as administrations have changed at long last in the United States from 8 years of the Bush administration to now the first start of the Obama years?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm pleased to be here, and I am so thrilled to be here with my esteemed colleagues, all of whom are real strong leaders in this field. It's very exciting to have them here. I would say that NCDD, which is a US-based network of about 1,400 people, it's a really strong and vibrant network. It's an active network. It's really grown from about 50 original members to these 1,400 now. And I've seen a lot of changes over the years. One of the things I noticed at the beginning was a real focus on specific methods. Everyone has these methods of dialogue or deliberation or public engagement that they focus on. You might have heard of some of them, like World Cafe or Open Space or Appreciative Inquiry. And over the years, we've seen people move from a real focus on specific issues to a more of a focus on trying new things, using multiple modalities, multiple methods, and mixing them together and becoming just more sophisticated in the way they do this work. In terms of the administration, when Obama became president, on his very first day as president, he signed a memorandum on open government, which talked about three kind of pillars of open government: transparency, collaboration among federal agencies, because this was directed at federal government agencies in the US, and public participation, which is what we're here to talk about today, what we're all really, really into. And what we've seen, our field got so excited about the Open Government Initiative, and we banded together. NCDD worked with the International Association for Public Participation, IAP2, and this great organization called the Co-Intelligence Institute, which is based in the US. And we developed a process. We used a participatory online process to develop core principles for this work, core principles for public engagement. And it was this moment of excitement in our field because we didn't know what was going to happen with this new open government directive. And we wanted to be very clear with the Obama administration of what we were talking about when we talked about public participation or public engagement, that it's about bringing all sides to the table. It's about having a diverse group of people get together. It's about really looking at the issues in depth, not having a surface exploration of issues, and all these other principles that were developed. We've seen over the course of the Obama administration so far that the real focus has been on transparency, one of those three pillars. And transparency really was about data, about openness with data. So you'll see federal agencies in the US posting more information about what they do and how they've come to decisions and what research they've done. But the emphasis on public participation has been just a little, a little bit of what they do. They're starting new online tools on their websites. They're getting people involved in dialogue on their online, although it's not necessarily what we in our field would consider dialogue. Really hearing in-depth stories from people and building trust over time. It's your basic online forum. So we're still hoping that more will come out of that from the Obama administration and beyond. And we think it's a really great first step for our field, but it's not as exciting as it was maybe on the first day of the Obama presidency.
Thank you.
Okay, we're just going to go to Scandinavia now from the US, and a very different culture, particularly in relation to these issues of public participation. I think it's a more amenable culture in many ways. Lars Kluver I've been a fan of Lars Kluver, I have to confess, for some decades, and that's because I think Lars, as the director of the Danish Board of Technology, led the way in relation to a number of deliberative processes, and we convened a consensus conference in Australia based on the Danish model. I know that Lars does many more participatory approaches than the consensus conference, but I'm interested in having you just tell us a little bit about how you use these approaches to address the challenges that Denmark faces. And I know you've moved even beyond Denmark in what you're doing, so tell us a little bit more about that work, and I'm sure that there is something that we can learn from in relation to the Danish experience.
First of all, I think it's important to say that the Danish experience was, Denmark has been some sort of a cradle for many of these processes, and I think the reason is that Denmark has had a special history. First of all, during the 70s, there was a lot of anxiety among politicians about how gene technology, nuclear tech, new energy technology, ICT at the workspace, how these things would be received when they began to appear. So there was an understanding that we had to be proactive in some way, try to solve the problems before they appeared. And I think Danish politicians are quite good at that, and that approach. So I think that's probably, some say to me that that's a Scandinavian thing. But there's another side of Danish history, which is that we have, since the end of the feudalism, had a tradition of say, collaborative education and collaborative problem solving, starting with the analphabetic peasants who suddenly were freed and from being farm workers suddenly should be farmers. So they developed systems together with philosophers of educating each other and making co-ops and developing technology together. And that is a system that still is living in Denmark. So that is cultural background that's I think made Denmark a cradle for some of these processes, because it was obvious then in the 80s when the Board of Technology was established to advise the parliament on technology and society issues, that we were expected to follow up on these cultures and involve citizens and involve stakeholders in our advisory work. So I think Denmark is a little yes, was good as a cradle. I think the understanding is, cradle. That's it. That was in the start. What I also see now is that it's spreading fast all over the world, really fast. I think that I can see that everywhere there's this idea that we are facing so complex challenges where it's not enough just to take a political decision and then hope that things happen. Just think of energy conservation, of sustainable living. There are so many issues that we have to solve, which cannot be solved without all levels in society working for it, including the single citizen. So policies have to be made in ways that actually are effective, and that means answering the needs and the possibilities of single citizens. So if you begin to think in those terms, then it's obvious that strategizing together with citizens makes sense. And I think that does make sense, yes. Strategizing if we want to solve those complex problems, definitely makes sense.
Well, I'll steer us to Canada, where Matt Leighninger is. He's been the director of the Deliberative Democracy Consortium for quite some time, and authored a book not too long ago called The Next Form of Democracy, which, as you might imagine, has something to do with this deliberative conception of democracy. The questions I'd like to put to you is, you've worked with and seen so many different processes over the years. What would you say are some of the challenges and obstacles to deliberative democracy? And in your book, you saw on the horizon a new form of democracy. How are we doing? Are we on schedule? When does the train come in?
You'll be arriving at 3:45. No, in retrospect, of course, what I should have named that book was the next forms, plural, of democracy, because, of course, this is going to lead to different things in different places. But the other thing is probably to give you the subtitle, which was how expert rule is giving way to shared governance and why politics will never be the same. And you see the strategy there, or if you make your subtitle long enough, then people don't have to read the book. But basically, so I think the bigger question is the kind of democratic evolution, is democratic change continuing? And I think you have to say yes. And certainly the big picture, which we really need to make sure we focus on, continues to, that evolution continues. And basically, the big picture, I think, is simply that citizens have different expectations and different capacities than they used to. That people have less time to devote to public life, yet they bring more capacities, more skills, more knowledge to the table when they get there. That people feel more entitled to the protection and services of government, yet less confident the government's going to deliver. That people in many ways are less connected to what's happening in their neighborhood or their community, but when they find an issue or a decision or a cause that they care about, they're better able to find the information, the allies, the resources they need to make an impact on that issue. So you could kind of sum this up by saying that people are better at governing and less willing to be governed than ever before. And I only see that trend accelerating not only in the US and Canada, but in other parts of the world as well. The other thing about that is that I think is going to make that accelerate even more is I think we've only begun to see the impact of the internet. I think in the first phase, I think the internet empowered individuals, and that's part of what has caused this change in citizen capacities and expectations. But in this next phase, I think what we're seeing increasingly with the rise of social media is the internet helping to empower groups, and that has a lot of implications for governance, all over the world. The other thing that I've seen, I think, in the last 4 years since the book was simply continuing affirmation of the things that we do know to work about how to mobilize citizens. There's certain kind of basic civic tactics, engaging large, diverse numbers of people, engaging them in small groups in addition to large groups, having good group process in terms of how those groups run, facilitation, as Sandy was saying, and group materials, structure that the group follows, ground rules set by the group. Those kinds of group process things continue to work in all kinds of different contexts. And also, I think a final thing of giving people the support and the expectation that they can be part of action, that it's not simply up to government or any other institution to implement what they want, but they need to also be part of that kind of problem solving. Those things continue to work. Unfortunately, the challenges are also there. And the biggest one of those is that that mainly what we have to point to are lots of exciting, interesting, temporary projects which have not been sustained. That these things are still incredibly difficult to staff and incredibly difficult to sustain. And that, having those challenges there, again, still is frustrating. And we see that also, I think, as Sandy pointed out, in kind of the story of the whole Obama experience so far. And that I think in the campaign really used some of these civic tactics. I think you can see an awareness of some of that, of those things that work in the way that they structured, the fact that they were able to get 3 million people to volunteer in a political campaign, in the ways in which they gave the volunteers authority over scores and sometimes hundreds of other volunteers. All those kinds of civic tactics, or many of them, were evident. The one that was not evident in the way they work was deliberation, which you can understand when it's a kind of campaign, but you can also see when you try to govern and use some of those same tactics in governing, the lack of that one dimension is really, really important. So the other encouraging thing, though, that I do see is that people are recognizing some of those challenges, recognizing that we have a lot of kind of good ideas, good tactics that have been used in temporary ways, and that what we really need to figure out is how to use them in more sustained ways. How do you take what we know and embed that into the way that communities function? So that you've got a space that's a continuing, regular space for citizens to be part of governance, to be part of community, and I think that if we can have, the more people we have kind of tackling that question in more different parts of the world, the better off we'll all be.
Alannah Mactiernan is joining us from Western Australia. And Alannah, in your time as Minister of Planning and Infrastructure, you actually had the chance to convene these kinds of processes that Matt and Sandy and others have seen. In your experience, what makes those work, and in particular from the perspective of a public official, what are really the incentives to do this, to change the way we govern ourselves?
Thank you very much for that question. Can you hear us? I guess I see this, I come to this from somewhat of a different position. I mean, there's a sort of a little bit of an undertone, perhaps from American friends of the people versus the government. From the perspective of being in politics, it was how do we actually resolve some of these, and my initial motivation was where you had very polarised communities, that many of the issues that we were confronting, it wasn't as if the community had a single view. The community had very, very much competing views, competing interests. So how do we bring those together rather than just being presented with a baby that you had to slash in half somewhere? How did you actually get people to come together and try to come up with a resolution that you were going to be able to more broadly implement to the satisfaction of the community? So that's a big issue. I think we must acknowledge that within our community, it's not the community doesn't have a single voice or a particular interest, a particular single view, that there is this multiplicity of views, and we need to somehow or other get people understanding that. And we've got to actually understand the context of the media, in the Western world at least, which is where, by and large, conflict is encouraged. I mean, conflict, anything that is black and white, good and bad, that's what sells. Grey is very boring, and outside Switzerland doesn't sell any newspapers or TV coverage. So we've got to try to, from my initial foray into deliberative democracy was to try to actually get people, various stakeholders together and get them to understand each other's point of view and to see how we could establish common ground. And then over time, we came to actually understand that there was a number of other positive things that would come out of this sort of process. One is that there were some very hard things that we actually didn't know the answers to, and the more that we had people turning their mind to it, the more likelihood that we were going to come up with good results. And there's a third element of this, and is that, and whilst I'll agree with you that there's part of much of the community which is now getting very engaged, the really, really sad thing for me as a parliamentary representatives is just how many people have absolutely zero interest, who go into the polling booth and write Mickey Mouse on their ballot paper, like we've never seen that one before. But what we, and that we sort of needed to somehow or other, and I think we very much need to, in our system, to get more people actually engaged in the process. And I think this idea that has been spoken of tonight about the need to embed this, not just to have these glamorous high-profile exercises, but to somehow or other start incorporating this into the very fabric of government. My view, particularly starting off with local government, where you start with issues that people find perhaps quite tangible and that they're able to easily connect with, and then building up this understanding and engagement. And John, if I can fire a question back to you, can I ask you to tell your story, which I think is the most incredible example of what happened, your research into jury study, and how engagement in one decision-making process can actually create citizens that are far more engaged?
Yeah, I think I'll take that. Thank you. So the jury system we often don't think about when we talk about politics and government, right? It's something else. but it's not. The judicial branch is just that. It's a branch of government. It may be that we're quite accustomed to it, and if you live in Australia or the United States or many other countries, you recognize that, yeah, you might be called to jury duty, you might have this temporary experience of assisting with the completion of a civil or a criminal trial, but that's not government, that's not politics. Well, of course it is. Again, it's just a branch of government that we're accustomed to playing a deliberative role in. And it took centuries for the jury to come to be the institution we know it as now. And it's even now being reformed and improved in wonderful ways to make it easier to be a juror, especially in the case of complex cases and so on, to deliberate better as a juror. But there's a few things in it that I want us to appreciate. One is, what is the relationship between the citizen and the government when you serve on a jury? Well, the government is your judge, and the judge is working with the jury, and the jury assists the judge, really. I mean, the jury renders a verdict, and the judge thanks the jury and sends them home, hopefully with a nice word. But the judge framed the trial, right? Gave the jury instructions, made decisions about evidence, and so on. And our research shows that the experience of serving on a jury, first of all, is actually much more pleasurable for the average juror than they expected, and certainly than we think about jury service. There are some brutal murders you might have to serve on once in a while, but for the most part, jury service is actually quite pleasant and brief. But the effect on the juror is, for many jurors, one of transformation, an awareness of, oh my gosh, this is what self-government means. I get it now. And in the United States, where voting is not compulsory, it actually makes jurors more likely to vote than they would have otherwise. But it has a cascade of other effects as well, making them more likely to participate in politics in various respects, depending in part on the quality of their experience as a juror. But the point is, again, it echoes a few of these themes. We have institutionalized a form of citizen deliberation. We have placed our trust in the hands of citizens, and they do quite well at it. Thank you very much. So I think the future is uncertain in terms of what kinds of deliberation might become institutionalized, but if the jury teaches us anything, it takes a long time, and there are very many sort of procedural refinements along the way that help make the institution something we can really be proud of.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to add something there. There are ways, I think, that we can, let me say that in Australia, I think juries don't always have a good reputation. I don't think people always have an excellent experience of jury duty, and there is an awareness that an awful lot of people manage to get out of jury duty. So although it involves conscription, there is an avoidance mechanism there. But we've fantasised about the idea of having policy juries. So if it's good enough to call people up to participate in a criminal jury about did someone kill that person or not, then the sense is that it's good enough to have people come together to deliberate on education policy or health policy and so on. And I think there's ways that we can refine the experience, the quality of the jury service, so that it is actually a better experience. There's some people that work near me at UWS who are doing work on just this, how to look at deliberation in the jury experience so that it is genuinely more deliberative and isn't as flawed as it has been.
And for many other deliberative processes, the jury and jury deliberation is an inspiration, but it's a form that's very different. So if I may turn to you, Lynn Carson was part of a large team of folks, including New Democracy and the Australian Research Council, who made possible the 2009 Australian Citizens' Parliament. Now that didn't look like a jury, it may have drawn a distant inspiration from it. But the question I want to put to you is, so the Australian Citizens' Parliament, was it worthwhile? What did we learn from it?
Yes, there was some frustration for us in that it took place on the weekend of those dreadful bushfires in Victoria in 2009. So boy, was it hard to get any media coverage on that event, and understandably. But we learned an enormous amount. I mean, obviously, like all of these processes, transformational for the participants. I think one of the early lessons for us was the take-up rate. We were genuinely surprised at the willingness of people to participate. Now, if we look at something like the floods that have just happened in Queensland and the willingness of people to spontaneously come forward and volunteer to help complete strangers, I suppose it shouldn't be a surprise that when they are randomly selected and asked to participate in a citizens' parliament, that we actually had a response rate of nearly 35%, which is nothing short of miraculous when you think about opinion surveys or any call for public duty. And because the focus of it was on how do we reform Australia's political system to serve us better, we were surprised by the willingness of people to participate, but also, I think, heartened by the transpartisan nature of the discussions that happened in that place. So we had regional meetings, we had online deliberations, and then they came together face to face in Canberra for a number of days. And there was considerable disagreement in the room, but fantastic, respectful discussion and dialogue. There were often observations about, why isn't anyone yelling at anyone? You know, we're all just sitting here nodding at each other. There was a way in which people genuinely wanted to listen to the views of others, and even if they disagreed, were able to explore common ground and to come to some recommendations that everyone felt extremely good about it. So it was an incredibly positive experience for us. It showed that a deliberative event of that massive scale, I mean, in a country the size of Australia, it's no mean feat, is something that is achievable, it can be done, and yes, tragically, it doesn't seem to have been repeated.
Well, we wanted to ask a more general question at this point, and we were thinking, what are some of the ways of demonstrating or testing the relevance of deliberative democracy to the world? And that makes you think about things like, well, does it have any relevance to something like what's happening in Egypt, which has to strike you as one of the most sort of remarkable and in some ways unexpected events in terms of governance and the role that citizens play. So we would put the question more broadly than that and just ask, what in the course of what's happening in the world today, that's just one example. What are some of the things you see that are relevant to deliberative democracy, and what can an understanding of deliberation and democracy bring to these sorts of challenges and questions we're facing?
And I'm wondering if I could leap in and ask Lars maybe to tell us a little about worldwide views on global warming, because to me that's a stunning exercise because it involved 38 countries, 4,000 people, simultaneous. I mean, this was a fairly remarkable event, I think, in deliberative democracy terms. So would you like to tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I think that connects well to your question, John. Yes, the Worldwide Views on Global Warming was a project we developed in connection to the COP15 meeting on climate change in Copenhagen, the catastrophic meeting. And but we didn't know that when we made that project. What we did was we invited countries to take part in a project where they would make 100 persons meetings each, and these meetings would use the same procedure, the same meeting form. They would get the same information material, the citizens participating. They would be put the same questions. And these questions would be put instantly on the internet, so we could see as during that day went along, the 26th of September 2009. It was Australia that came with the first results actually, and we could see the results coming in during the day. And one of the anxieties we had, and that connects a little to this with the international level, was, would this at all work? I mean, we're talking about Chinese, Indonesians, Australians, African countries, Latin American countries, Europe, Northern America. We're talking about so different cultures and possibly very different cultures with respect to how you have discourses. So would it at all work to use the same method all around the world? And it worked. It worked perfectly. And in a way we weren't surprised, because there had been other methods. For example, consensus conferences and Citizen Summit, deliberative polls. They had been developed someplace and then imported another place, and they worked. So these methods, these involving methods, they travel well, and I think that's very interesting. And that means that countries that need to develop a broader discourse can do it quite fast. They do not need to wait for processes to develop in their countries. They can actually learn, import, and they will probably work. And so they can help in building up structures, a new society, and so on, if the courage is there to try it.
We've certainly seen that with participatory budgets in South America. They've now spread throughout the world, and they've had them in China recently. And I think what you say about that transferability of these models or approaches is salient. Sandy, did you have anything you wanted to add to this notion of how we can address these complex challenges of our time?
Sure. I wanted to mention some of the things that have happened in the U.S. that really caused a lot of kind of fervor and energy around this kind of work, around bringing people together across differences to address issues in a very different way. One of them was I don't know if you guys are familiar with the kind of town hall meetings that happened in August 2000, well, was it 2009 or 2010? August 2009 in the U.S., where people were just upset about potential healthcare legislation, the idea of universal health care and whatever, all these different things that were in Obama's healthcare plan. I don't know if you saw it in the news over here, but these town hall meetings that brought citizens together were highly volatile, a lot of people expressing a lot of emotion, and it was very hard to have any kind of civil discourse. It was just people firing off opinions about the legislation or assumptions. And we recently had, and that caused a lot of people in our field to write letters to the editor and write blog posts and things like this that we tried to keep track of, and we tried to encourage people to do more of that. And more recently, just about a month ago or so, there was a shooting in Tucson. I don't know if you guys heard about this over here, but a good number of people killed and injured, and there was a U.S. congressperson there, and she was injured really badly, shot in the head. And that caused our field to say, how can we be encouraging people to be more civil with each other, to handle issues more civilly, to be able to talk about politics in a more open way and not have so much anger built up, and not be able to actually talk beyond partisan lines. And so there's these things that come up in our field, and one of my great frustrations is that our field is not necessarily equipped to deal with these kinds of issues. We feel like we have this big solution, and it's not a panacea. It's not, you need to have people involved in deliberation and everything will be okay, but it really is, there are instances where it should happen and could really make a difference in real conflicts in the world, in the U.S. and across the world. So it's just something that we're continuing to try to struggle with, build capacity in our field. And that's the other thing I wanted to quickly mention, is just the concept of capacity building in our communities, so that we don't have to convince people over and over again and try to use the media to say, hey, this time is really ripe for dialogue. People need to come together and talk. They need to address issues in a different way, but we need to actually make sure that our communities are functioning differently, so that dialogue and deliberation and all of these different ways of handling really contentious issues are part of just how we do business in our country, in the U.S. and here we're talking about the same thing about Australia at this meeting. How do we build the civic capacity in our communities so that this kind of work is just part of doing business? It's just how things are run. When there's a conflict, you get people together, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You have facilitators in place, and you have politicians who understand the work and are supporting the work and really value the work. All of those things are in place. So.
Well, if I can jump in there, I mean, one of the really worrisome and frustrating things about the whole situation with Egypt and Tunisia and other countries like that is that we don't have that set of ideas and recommendations to offer. We meaning kind of the rest of the world, right? Because we have great models, we've got great stories of kind of processes in which people were able to affect an issue and do something, but we don't have those kinds of recipes for how democratic governance should look. And we know that throughout history we have a long tradition of people taking to the streets, of democratic movements leading to Republican reforms. And that seems like that's the most likely outcome here. Well, of course, one likely outcome is that's quite possible, of course, in these situations is that an authoritarian regime either takes control again or a new authoritarian regime comes in. But, in this case, so obviously that's the worst case scenario. But what looks like right now is the best case scenario in these places is a parliamentary democracy, which of course will be better than an authoritarian regime, but a parliamentary democracy with all of the same weaknesses and flaws that our current parliamentary democracies have. And so we need to figure out in a much more concerted way, what does democratic governance look like? How do you structure it so that it is that kind of ongoing space that creates those kinds of ongoing spaces for people to be part of self-governance?
Look, I think these issues are very complex. Obviously, in Egypt, the fundamental problem is that there probably is no democracy, and that the ballot process, the establishment of even a representative democracy is not functioning. So I think that's. I think we've got to just be a little bit careful about the claims that we're making there. I agree, though, that this is very much about capacity building within our society so that we can get better quality decisions. But we do have some work to do to try to work out where a deliberative democracy fits in with a representative democracy. In our parliamentary system, everyone gets to vote. And as we know from the last federal election, you'll recall that when some deliberative democracy ideas were put forward, there was a great critique and opposition to this on the basis that, well, we've already got a forum, we elect you representatives, and that's your job to go and make the decisions. And that actually became quite a powerful issue during the federal election, and the idea of a citizens' parliament to consider climate change was sort of dropped like a hot potato. But it is really important, I think, to work out how we fit these things together. But it's also, my view, very much along the lines of what you were saying, that we need to have this capacity building because, quite frankly, in my view, representative democracy won't last and won't be effective if we don't have an engaged citizenry. If we don't have a group of, the majority of people being deeply engaged and interested in the political process, then even representative democracy is not going to work. So I think it really, and particularly in pluralist societies, it is so important for us to have these mechanisms that we can turn to help resolve and bring the community together so we can, in fact, move forward, as we say.
I think I just want to add a postscript there because it's something that I've been writing a bit about is that I think actually I controversially called a paper "Ignorance, Mr. Jefferson is Good for Democracy" because I was trying to argue that we actually don't all need to be engaged and we don't all need to be fully informed, that I think there is such a thing as rational ignorance and that we learn a great deal about a topic when we have a need to learn about a topic. Otherwise, we happily leave it in the hands of others. We heard today about the British Columbian experiment with the Citizens' Assembly and how people who voted in support of the particular voting system that was on offer voted for it because they trusted the activities of the 160 people who had deliberated for a very long period of time. Now, the voters didn't particularly, they felt, need to go off and find out everything they needed to know about the single transferable vote, which was kind of the model that was suggested. But they had sufficient confidence in a group of citizens like themselves who had deliberated very deeply on it, that they felt confident that it was a good model that was being offered. If it had been been a parliamentary committee, unfortunately, I suspect the voters would have suspected that maybe, you know, the model on offer might have been feathering the nest of the people who put it forward. So I think we, you know, in any situation where we're doing decision making, it's always good to have a neutral group do the thinking and the deliberating on it. And when it does actually affect the parliamentary process itself, I think it's a wise move to put something like that in the hands of the voters themselves. So I'm just not convinced that all citizens have to be engaged and all citizens have to be knowledgeable in order for us to be able to move forward. I think we do need to find ways of tapping into the wider community's creativity and collective intelligence without losing sight of the point that Alannah is making, that we need to find ways of integrating that into the representative system. We're not going to throw out representative government tomorrow, so we need to find ways of making a more robust system of government, and just as much as we need to create more robust systems or approaches to deliberative democracy.
Lynn, can I just comment on that? Because just on the ignorance issue, and I'm certainly not arguing that, you know, to make a decision on every issue, every citizen needs to be engaged, but there has to be a culture of people taking an interest in politics. I mean, one of the things, that is just completely disheartening as a politician is like how some simplistic mantra can override a rational argument. Now, unless we have a public that, whilst they might not want to be engaged in every issue, is encouraged into that decision-making process by having some experience of the decision-making process, we're not going to have people that are going to be making, I think, informed decisions on who their parliamentary representatives are. You know, so it really goes back to the crux of, if you really want a parliamentary system that works, it actually requires us to have more and more deliberative processes to keep people engaged. And that's why I'm strongly of the view, and John, why I thought that experience that you uncovered, that people that had served on jury duty were more likely to vote and more likely to be engaged in their communities after that experience, is a very, very interesting one, and why I think it is absolutely critical that we actually try to start developing these processes very much as part of the local government experience and then build on that.
I think that's true, the local government experience. And before I go to Lars, I just wondered if, John, you'd like to talk about the Oregon experience, because that is a way of linking the two, I think, in the way that Alannah would like to see.
Sure. I mean, one way of thinking about deliberative democracy is that, like any democracy, it's about a whole system, right? It's not just something that happened on one day or one particular branch of government. A democracy has to be a whole system. And when Alannah says, you know, we want an interface between representative government and these forms of citizen involvement, one of the ways I think about it is that in some contexts, we want to make sure that the citizenry deliberates in the election to get representatives who will be keen on deliberating themselves in government, whether with citizens, with experts, or among themselves in a legislature. And so that's one short answer, is that I think we need to think not just about deliberation on questions that the government is facing, but also how to improve citizen deliberation in elections. The example that Carson brings up with Oregon, which is a state in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, in Oregon, they're interested in that very question of how to improve the quality of citizen deliberation. But the ballot in Oregon, as in many Western states in the U.S., contains both candidates and parties and policy questions. And so what they implemented in Oregon, and this is something passed by the Oregon legislature in 2009, actual state law that they tried out for a year and now they're considering for renewal. They took a random sample of Oregonians, 24, to study one of the questions on the ballot. And then at the end of a 5-day deliberation, those citizens are responsible for producing a 1-page analysis that is then sent to the household of every voter in the state of Oregon. In effect, what's happening is you're having a small face-to-face deliberative group help a mass public engage in a deliberative exercise. Now, if to take one example, one of the issues was medical marijuana. If I'm one of those 24 people, I become very knowledgeable about that initiative. At the end of 5 days, I know how I'm going to vote, and I have reasons, and I can write those down. Now I pass those on to the other voters. Now if I'm a voter, I get my voting guide, and it has this page of analysis. I'm not an expert on medical marijuana when I open that guide, and when I finish reading that page, I'm still not an expert. And to some extent, like in British Columbia, I have to kind of trust that my fellow citizens did a good analysis and the arguments that are there are sound. And now I can make a judgment, a somewhat well-informed judgment, but still, it was only a matter of minutes that I read that page, and I vote. And I'm done, and I close up my ballot, and in Oregon, I drop it in the mail. And now an hour, a day, a week later, I know almost nothing about medical marijuana. But for a moment, I knew more before I voted. And that to me is an example of one way in which we try to improve not just the quality of deliberation in a small group, but actually the quality of deliberation in a larger group. It doesn't transform people's knowledge of the issue, but maybe it does change their expectations for how much they need to know before they make their next vote.
You had something to say, Lars?
Well, I just think there is definitely a hand in the egg discussion about the opportunity. I don't think this...
They're just closer to you.
Close to you now.
Oh, it goes in and out. There is... I think there is definitely a hand in the egg discussion between the opportunity of taking part in policy development and the motivation for taking part in policy. I mean, if you get the opportunity, if you can see that that's something your society has installed and you can take part, then you begin to look for these opportunities and you begin to volunteer. And when you have volunteered, you will even think that we should have more on this. And so it's a process that goes on and on if you started it. And therefore, institutionalization is so important, I think. It's so important that on all these policy levels we have in our society, from international to national to regional, municipality, city, local surroundings, that we have someone who takes responsibility for setting up these things, as who can make the opportunity. Because if the opportunity is there, then the willingness to take part is also there, I think.
And I think just to take up Alannah's point, I think some of the best stuff is happening in local government, isn't it? And for the reasons that she pointed out, you know, that it's the government closest to the people, and I think it's very effective at that level. I'd like to encourage anyone who'd like to contribute to the conversation to approach the microphones. There's two, as Meredith pointed out, and John's going to chair this part of it.
I'm a dual national Australian-American, but I can be miserable anywhere. It's a gift I have. I'm a former Oregonian, and I was elected precinctman in Portland. And I was very involved with ballot measures and citizen-initiated referenda. But it's a very enlightened state, and very interested in what you were saying this morning on radio. But I was really dismayed with what happened in California with Gray Davis, with the recall. Now, they've talked about having a recall option here in New South Wales for the comedy state government that we've got. But what happened was almost anything coming out of Macquarie Street, you know, you need a health warning, you know, don't operate machinery, or, you know, get down off the ladder, you might fall off and hurt yourself laughing, or coffee will come out your nose. But Gray Davis was okay on public electricity. The power situation was fine, and then you had these people outside of California with the deliberative process. It was wholly railroaded or shanghaied, and Gray Davis, who was doing a good job, and then California had a little blip which was caused by outside private power issues, then derailed through using a deliberative process to get him recalled and put Schwarzenegger in. Now, Schwarzenegger did an okay job as an environmental... Anyone who goes to California has to be okay environmentally, ultimately. So Schwarzenegger did an okay job, but anyone could have done an okay job in California.
So we got the context.
Yeah.
Hit us with the question.
Sometimes it can be derailed. So, like, you need to watch that process, because those people getting those signatures came from outside of California, outside of the state.
I think that's a very interesting question, and perhaps this is, we need to contrast perhaps direct democracy in a way with participatory democracy. And I think very fundamental to the concepts that we are all promoting is not just a referendum where it's yes or no, because that tends to lead to polarisation. I think the processes that are fundamental to deliberative democracy are actually getting people together to try to establish common ground. So whereas the way the referenda, I think, that you're referring to, or the recall motions refer to, that they actually have behind them the opposite sort of incentive, because you actually want to polarise and make more extreme your argument to try to get as many people as possible out to support your case. So it is another form of direct democracy, but ours that we're talking about here today focuses on a deliberative democracy, engagement in the ideas and common ground.
I think you've got that one hit. Let's go ahead and try this.
Look, thank you very much. I don't know much about deliberative democracy, but I'm learning lots from you, and I'm really inspired by it all. But a bit like the previous speaker, I'm interested in whether deliberative democracy includes, at some level, an analysis of the existing power structure. I'm very aware of the long and wonderful, noble history of further democratisation, but often we're not very literate about the nature of the power structure and how democratic traditions get subverted and get short-changed. So in Australia, we had a Labor government, which was a different type of political party, the most successful one in the world in 1910. But you'd never know it now, because the Labor Party, back in the 80s, brought in a whole lot of neoliberal policies which were identical with the Liberal Party. Okay, so they're much closer together, and a whole lot of decisions about free trade and global things actually subvert national sovereignty and take it out of the voting, the prospects of public choice. So all the privatisation that's happened in the last 30 years has been typically opposed in public opinion polls by 60 to 70% of the time. And at the moment, the state Labor government is likely to lose the election, and they're committed to the privatising of our electricity supply, sort of thing.
So the question is whether a deliberative conception or approach to democracy is naive to power relationships, or if somehow those are taken into account in designing the process?
Yes, or does deliberative democracy include an explicit analysis or critique or opposing positions?
I think we're going to get you some answers.
Oh, good. Thank you.
The answer is yes, when it's done well. Because when you decide to make a participatory process, you hopefully have considered already before you started if it will work in the existing, and if it can supplement and help existing power structures. I mean, the reason for making a participatory process is not to confront necessarily those structures. It is to make them work better, to supplement them. So part of setting up such a process is to look at what's going on here, who's in power, what's the hot questions, where are the conflicts found, and then design the process so that you can actually help those power structures work better.
And I'm going to give a slightly different answer, complementary, hopefully, not contradictory. Deliberative democracy is a model or a theory of democracy. And these models of democracy are ideas about how we could govern ourselves. There is no, in the strong meaning of the word, there is no democracy in the world. There never will be. There are people and governments who strive to be more democratic. And the whole reason for kind of inventing the term deliberative democracy was a dissatisfaction with other conceptions of it, that what they were missing was a serious concern about the quality of argument, not just whether everyone's participating, which is important, not just whether the media was free, which is important, but what was the actual content of discourse? Were people putting forward good arguments? Were they listening to each other respectfully, in an inclusive way? And that approach to democracy can be relevant to what you just said, but it can also be used on a much more abstract level. We can ask whether we are a deliberative democracy as a society. And now we're not any longer talking about how we design a process or how we hold a particular election, but we're asking whether as a society we think seriously about the challenges that face us, whether we talk through those things. And in that sense, power and power relations are one of the things on the table. Not for a particular process, not for a particular government, but for the society. Do we have, for instance, a class in our society that is essentially an underclass, that is a permanent minority? Do we talk about that? Are we honest about that? Is it represented in our art? All of these are relevant questions to whether we are, as a society, a deliberative democracy. So again, if it's done well, yes. And again, that's just an example of how we might aspire to, as a society, engage those questions.
Thank you. I'm interested in the example that was given in the conversation just before about what's happening in Egypt, and perhaps just before that in Tunisia and elsewhere, and wondering whether we might think about ourselves, perhaps in our community of interest here, being a little bit ethnocentric about what we mean by democracy, and whether we are perhaps paying enough attention or being alert enough to forms of engagement and deliberation that have always been the case in different cultures. We've been observing about the importation, if you like, of European concepts to other parts of the world. I've just met with colleagues in Japan last year, and we're thinking about how we adapt the Consensus Conference and other participatory technology assessment in Japan and New Zealand and the Asia Pacific. But is there a need for us to pay attention to local cultural forms and not just assume a monolithic idea about democracy and forms, cultural forms of deliberation?
Thank you for the question. And I, again, encourage people to keep coming down. Thank you so much for these questions.
Yeah, I think especially I think the U.S., of course, is more guilty of this than anyone else, but kind of the idea that, that one can import democracy and that we have, basically what we have imported or tried to import is a combination of kind of elections and individual rights. And it's not, you know, obviously the full picture. And I think where you look right now for the biggest innovations in democracy are in fact places like Brazil and India. That in fact the global south is leading the way in democratic innovation, not only in terms of how they engage people, you know, Lars mentioned the participatory budgeting things, but also kind of how do they build this in? And, you know, in part of it, what's interesting about some of those places is that the whole notion of constitutions is a much more flexible thing. These are not places where the constitutions are 200 years old and therefore seemingly unchangeable. These are places where the Constitution is much younger, and where the whole idea of kind of the legal framework upholding participation, people kind of feel like they can experiment with that, and have been, excuse me, have been experimenting with it. So I think, and John Gaventa actually has been probably the most helpful. He's an academic who works on the global south. He's based in Britain, but basically, the way he puts it is that instead of kind of trying to import ideas about democracy from the developed West to other places, that we need to be reversing the flow, and that we need to have a much more equitable global conversation about what democracy means, the forms that it takes. Now, I think though that once we do that, I think generally what we find are a lot more universals than differences. You find that, you know, in culture after culture in different parts of the world, the same things that work are evident, and so I think what we find is a lot more commonness than difference. But still, that has to kind of emerge from a much more equitable conversation about what democracy means than what we've had so far.
I just want to say that I'm one of those who are not very fond of the term deliberative democracy, and the reason is that there's a direction in it towards democracy and towards export of democracy, which I don't think is needed at all. Collaborative problem solving is something that can work in any kind of society, and actually works in any kind of society. So that's more on the meta level, but on the very specific level, these processes, they work in most cultures. I would say in all cultures, but they have on a micro level, there has to be adjustments to them very often. I have been advising some people in Japan who made participatory processes, and there they have this paternalistic structure. So it's difficult for a person to speak with a professor. So you have to find a trick to make that happen, and those tricks can be found. So you have to make micro adjustments, but they are micro adjustments. The process as such works.
And I wanted to say one thing. Your comment made me think about the fact that sometimes we frame this work as a new idea. This is a new thing that we need to implement, and a lot of the processes really come from indigenous cultures. You know, we're talking about getting people together in small circles and passing a talking stick. Even if there's no talking stick, we're talking about one person speaking at a time, everybody having a turn. And it's important to recognize that and validate that.
Yeah, I wanted to make an observation about somewhere quite close to home, and that is Timor, that I think there was such a tragically missed opportunity when Timor gained its independence. And again, like many of the countries we've talked about, whether it's Iraq or, you know, we just impose a system of governance that we think is, and by impose I mean we go in quickly with advisors and those who will steer the country towards our particular path, whether it's the form of governance or the economy or whatever, without any consideration, as Sandy says, of, you know, how they actually have a fantastic form of collaborative decision-making in their villages and communities, and that was all thrown away, and we gave them a wonderful parliamentary assembly instead.
Let's continue.
I would also like to refer very quickly to regime change and the relevance of deliberative democracy. We see the Middle East model currently being played out. We saw the pretty disastrous American model in Iraq. But maybe you guys missed the Australian model, because it happened so quickly, so clinically. It happened overnight and everyone watched it on national television. We knew more than the politicians did at the time. Now, seriously, the link was very much to public opinion polling and what we call focus groups. Do you guys see the connection between focus groups and deliberative democracy?
We don't like focus groups.
Can I tell you that most politicians hate focus groups, and focus groups tend to be the things that are much embraced by party officials to control politicians, and many of us rail against what we see as a mindless adherence. But there is a real difference, and you quite rightly point to a problem with our political process in the way that focus groups have been overused and indeed misused. Now, the difference where the focus group tends to be in modern political practice in Australia, a focus group is a group of swinging voters in a marginal seat. So it's one very small segment of the population whose opinion is tested, and not tested in any particularly elaborate way, but just tested as what is that opinion as it is now, and how would that change if we just changed this set of words. And so in fact, probably does not include a consideration of what the sort of at least 70% of the population might think. And the other fundamental difference between a focus group and deliberative democracy, and I go back to this because it is so critical, or deliberative processes, if Lars doesn't like the word democracy, that it is about thinking the issues through. Now, the focus group is the antithesis of that. It's basically about, well, like, what's really your first impression? Deliberative democracy, deliberative processes are about examining the ideas, contesting the ideas, and trying to develop a common ground and a way forward. So it is a fundamentally very, very different process, and you quite rightly point to the flaws in a reliance on focus groups.
Let me tell you very quickly that a focus group is much better than a party branch meeting.
Well, it depends on your branch, obviously.
And let me say that surely citizens' assemblies and focus groups both have the discipline of being the right demography, the representative of the population at large. Surely there is that parallel.
I think can I just come in and say, I think a useful distinction, and Alannah was really making it, is that a focus group is about public opinion and deliberative approaches are about public judgment. And that's the real difference between the two. And you're right, you know, you could get a demographically representative focus group, a demographically representative group that would come together for a public deliberation, but it's what they then do that distinguishes them. And one is about testing opinion, the other is about deeply deliberating in order to create a judgment or come to a judgment.
Yeah, but you're taking it much further than the focus group. You're
But the focus
building
group
on
isn't.
that.
Can I just point this out? The focus groups are not wide samples. They are basically, they're chosen. I mean, they cost them a lot of money to run, and they choose only swinging voters in marginal seats, which probably account for, say, 30, maybe max 40% of the population. The other population is not even considered. Their views aren't brought into account because they're wanting to focus on those people whose vote they think they can swing. So I personally, when you go into the detail of how focus groups are selected, they are not broadly representative of the community.
Let me go ahead and go to our next question. Please, thank you.
Hi. I was really interested in what the panel said about the sort of transformative potential of deliberation, in terms of changing people's perceptions about ideas, but also about the sense of themselves, as empowered citizens. And I'm really curious to what extent does that transformation rely on a face-to-face experience as opposed to online forms of deliberation? And I guess the reason I ask is because it would be great if that transformative experience could, I guess, be extended to large numbers of people. But I know that might be complicated because I have a feeling that, part of the transformation is really about that sort of face-to-face personal experience. So I'd be really interested in the panel's views on that.
Well, I can say that I was a project manager of the first consensus conference made, and it still doesn't work. So I was the project manager of the first consensus conference, and that was a quite intensive process because everybody were excited, me as well, and out of this panel in a consensus conference, you typically have between 12 and 16 panelists, citizens, made up by a very mixed composition of citizens. And out of these, we had 14. There were 2 women who had never been involved in politics. After this experience, they went into politics, both of them. I don't think that will happen after a dialogue on a blog on the internet. So I mean, it's an experience, it's a life experience for many people to take part in these processes, and they suddenly begin to believe in social, political systems in a way they have never done before.
Yeah, I feel differently, but it's more about the potential of online engagement. There are some great case studies of really influential online engagement that has rivaled face-to-face in the how people have transformed their opinions or opened up to new perspectives. Of course, what we see for the most part online is not anywhere close to that. We see a lot of flamers, people just freaking out basically online and blasting their opinion, and then others blasting their opinion. And we don't see a lot of real back and forth and quality discussion. And I think a lot of people are looking at how can we change that. And there were some people at the meeting talking today about different platforms that are available for online dialogue, and some people are looking to Facebook. How can you actually use tools like Facebook to go beyond what the normal conversation is now online? Some of the little things that can be done in any online platform are just, making sure that there's someone watching the discussion. It can't be done on any platform, but on a lot of platforms you have a moderator who's kind of watching the tone, and if someone is just, going crazy like they do online and insulting people in an extreme manner and just not being open to other perspectives that at all and just disrupting the whole thing, you can remove them, you can remove the posts, you can encourage people in different ways to post something that's thoughtful and that is really responsive to others' comments rather than just sharing your own top of the head kind of response. So there's a lot of little things like that, and I think we're really still learning how to do that online. And it's not easy. Online has great potential to involve so many more people and to do it so much more cheaply than bringing people together face to face, and to bring people together across huge countries like Australia or across the globe, and that really can't be you can't sniff at that. That's really important. So, but it's definitely something that we have a lot of learning to do in our field to make sure that we know what we're talking about and how to encourage real dialogue and real deliberation to happen online.
If I can just offer a little bit more analysis, but I'm going to start it with a pitch. One of the things that's exciting about thinking about online democratic deliberation is that the online environment, new media technologies are very dynamic. Facebook is something you wish you knew about 10 years ago. These things move so quickly that it's surprising how new interfaces, new designs, and so on, how fast they're adopted and how much they change our environment. So the inspiration I'm asking for is someone out there in that audience right now, one of you, may have an idea, and hopefully you can talk with others about that idea for how to make the online experience more powerful. So the analysis is this, that some of the things that make a deliberative experience transformative, and we can see this with the jury, are these kinds of elements. It should be cognitively engaging, right? Some online interactions are kind of thin, but some are more engaging. It should be, if possible, emotionally engaging. And again, online, maybe you don't get that sense of attachment with face-to-face, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you reveal yourself in a deeper way. It should be something where everyone's understanding what's going on. Again, sometimes online it's scattered and chaotic, but sometimes with a good moderator, and on I could go. But you start to try to identify those things that make the face-to-face experience special, and then you try to find a way to incorporate those online and potentially get additional advantages of being online. So if you're the next innovator in the interface for our online experience, you'll be doing the world quite a favor. Next question, please.
My name's Robert, and I'd like to ask about lobbyists. I don't think we've discussed that, and to add a bit of meat to the question for the panel about lobbyists. Considering, say, representative democracy as having been around a bit more than deliberative democracy, and so lobbyists is an issue we have there, and we try and regulate there. And so I wonder how deliberative democracy will help that issue, or perhaps itself be subject to and tainted to by the issue of lobbying. So how could we develop deliberative democracy to be able to withstand the issues of lobbying more? And if we think about what was mentioned before, which is the Citizens Climate Change Assembly that got kicked back, I think as Alannah reminded us, the whole issue of climate change is where we suspect that the lobbyists have a disproportionate distortion of the public policy agenda. So imagine, and you can speculate about how the assembly would run, and imagine if we had 100 citizens who were selected and they got known, and when the lobbyists in the fossil fuel industry want to find out who they are, and they will want to start to try and influence whatever decisions were trying to be made in the assembly. And so how would we as people know about that? So when I get my one-page flyer of summaries, I can trust that that is a genuine, objective view, and it hasn't been twisted and paid for by a particular organisation.
Just to give one example, one of the reasons we made the worldwide views on global warming connected to COP15 was exactly that around COP15 there would be so much lobbying, and all these lobby groups would claim that they were representing the public in some way, or the public interest in some way. And so one of the questions we asked ourselves is then what interests in the views of the public? And that was why we developed that project. I think it's a test on many of the messages that lobby groups come with to politicians. So if you can bring it in the rationalities of the public in a good form for politicians, then they have something they can mirror the lobbyist expressions up against.
And look, it's a very, very legitimate question, and in fact we had one example where one of our processes was actually subverted by a group that was caucusing. So it can happen. But if you think about one of the powers that lobbyists have, you look at the mining tax debate, and these lobbyists have enormous amounts of money that they can put behind you, that they can then use to support your opposition and end your political career. I think to a large extent, in the citizens' assembly process, there is a bit more immunity to that, because you're only there for this occasion. You're only there to put your point of view, to deliberate on that. Your career is not, or your political future is not dependent on whether or not these lobbyists are going to actually oppose you. So I think there are some. I mean, it's an issue that we have to be alert to. But there is a systemic difference, I suspect, between the position of a private citizen engaging in a deliberative exercise and a politician that may be facing a well-funded opposition if they don't kowtow.
In some ways, I think it is a kind of progress to have lobbyists and any kind of organized interests, to have them trying to exert influence directly on citizens rather than simply on public officials. And I think there's probably some good outcomes to that. And I know of some examples where that's happened. In like Los Angeles, where they created a few years ago this very extensive neighborhood council system. One of the things that happened is that on issues that were affecting businesses, the businesses would in fact start going to the neighborhood council meetings and actually try to kind of basically make their case for whatever they wanted or whatever they were opposing directly to the people of the neighborhood, as opposed to their council member. Now, one thing that was missing in that situation that is really important here is having a good process, good deliberative process, in fact, that allows people then to take that input as part of the various things that they're considering, and so that they're not simply being kind of, getting a single message about something. They're actually looking at a bunch of different options and taking that input, but also weighing other things. An example of that was interesting was in Oklahoma, where there was a statewide process about criminal justice and corrections policy, and the police in Oklahoma were trying to use this whole process, which was engaging large numbers of people, to advocate for a pay raise. And so they sent sheriffs and police officers to all these deliberations as they were happening throughout the state, armed with pamphlets explaining why the law enforcement people needed pay raise. But the structure was very good, and the people kind of hosting the conversations said, wow, that's terrific, we're glad you're here, please put your pamphlets on the resource table over here and join the discussion. and some of those police officers and sheriffs ended up being terrific participants in the dialogues, in fact enriched it, but ended up being deliberators like everyone else, not simply lobbyists for their particular cause. So I think, as long as, I think it's good to have a different, it's good to kind of shift the focus from lobbyists only to public officials to lobbyists to broader numbers of people, but that also what needs to go on there is process which enables people to digest that.
So we have just enough for one more question, and thank you for waiting patiently.
Mass society, and you're talking about some relatively small scale, quite careful processes to arrive at a high quality judgment based on a whole lot of evidence and discussion. Eventually you're going to want to communicate those results beyond that small group, and that's probably going to involve either the use of our current mainstream media, which has already been noted is fairly conflict driven. It's also fairly shallow and broad rather than deep. Your other option would be the use of the internet, which for all its promise, as has already been noted, tends to be a pretty uncivil sort of space, and the kind of, let's say you set up a blog where we can read through all the comments and all the discussion is really niche. The number of people who are going to read that kind of thing is really small. I mean, let's face it, the Sydney Morning Herald's top read stories are not about, they might be about Egypt because that looks pretty exciting and it's got some great images, but it's about, look, someone's just had a baby or a boob job. So how might there be some, I don't assume you have the answers, but what might be some of the ways we can get beyond that into getting these ideas out there and discussed by more people than just the ones who've had the benefit of 3-5 days of sitting and just talking about them?
I just want to answer that by saying that's been the topic of discussion for much of today, we actually think it's one of the areas that we need to pay more attention to, is how do we promote this work? You know, how do we make it compelling? How do we communicate the efficacy of this work? And I don't think it's particularly easy. The people who are in the process themselves are very transformed by it, as you mentioned, and Alannah could tell you a story of, in WA, of the people themselves contradicting the media's, you know, the newspaper writing critical stuff, and the people who had been engaged in the process coming out and saying, no, it wasn't like that at all, it was actually really good. So they're often great defenders of the process, but I wish I had a better answer than that, but it sounds like you're interested in it, so I think you should join with us and tell us how to do this. But did someone else have a comment?
I'm sorry. I wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, the deliberative process does not always happen over, you know, a long period of time, you know, a 3-day period of time. Sometimes it can be a 2-hour process or a 1-day process, and there's some methods that are able to involve thousands of people in one room or networked across different cities, and also online. And Matt always talks about the importance of a mass audience, you know, getting critical mass, getting lots of people involved. And so there's a lot of people in our field that try to involve as many people as possible. And the idea of doing that is that partly you will build up this influence, that you'll create something big enough that media has to cover it and politicians have to listen to it, and it doesn't always happen that way, but that's the, you know, part of the theory of getting lots of people involved. And there's a lot of other people in the field who believe that the best thing to do is to randomly select people in a scientific manner, and to get, you know, 12 people in a room or 8 people in a room for a longer period of time to really delve into the issues in more depth, and that's when you really have that clear challenge of, okay, what's the so what there? Are decision makers bought in the beginning that they're definitely going to take this advice, this data, these recommendations into consideration? Are they involved in the process? You know, what is the link to action? And we're definitely still struggling with that. But there's many different forms of dialogue and deliberation that involve different lengths of time and different numbers of people.
So as we near the close of the evening, we have the honor of our last question.
Thank you, John. I have to admit who I am, because I'm involved in the establishment of New Democracy with Carson and others. And one thing that intrigues me about this whole question of democracy is how we can move beyond this representative phase, because I am increasingly of the view that the partisan phase that we're in is becoming very quickly post-partisan. So that would suggest that our representative democratic system needs to be augmented or replaced by something else. And I was instigated, to come up and talk, because when Matt said, here's this issue about Egypt, and we could propose something, but we'd have just our parliamentary democracy that we currently have to propose, and he didn't sound terribly enthusiastic about that, and neither am I. And so what after 5 years of working with Carson on this, deliberative democracy is great, fantastic. That's the sort of processes that we need to have, but we actually need to find a new model. And the problem is there isn't a precedent right now. We all think we've reached somehow the apex of democracy, but we've got to move beyond it. And we're starting to think about new models. And I'm coming across the sort of work that I mentioned this morning with Alex Zavaris. You can look at the website, a citizen senate of randomly selected citizens that then deliberate on what the lower house puts up to them. Now, these are sort of interesting things for me. I think, like most of us, when I started this thing, most of people would come to me and say, well, what do you propose as an alternative? And that's the real issue for me. What can we really propose as an alternative? Yes, we can have all the deliberations happening around, and that's all good, but we're all coming to the point, up here at the panel as well, I think, is trying to understand how we can really integrate something that we believe in.
So let me put that question to the panel. I hear it as what, in your view, is the most viable alternative, or if more modestly, alteration to the conventional status quo form of politics and government?
Well, if I can just say, I think this is something that is evolving, and Luca, I think you've done a fantastic job with your support of this whole movement, and your particular proposal may be one solution. But I think there is another thing happening in society generally, and it is that people are demanding more interactive processes. And I think one of the reasons why representative democracy is not cutting the mustard is that it is not giving people that sort of level of engagement that they are now expecting and experiencing in all these other spheres of their life. So whether or not it's one particular entity that we can set up that is going to be the new model, or whether it has to be something that is more deeply ingrained, as I say, at all levels of the political process, where there is more interaction and dialogue at every level with everyone that wants to be involved. And that's, I think, going to be the challenge of the process. It won't just be one other forum of people, but an ongoing, continuous process of interaction.
And adding to the complexity there is that different communities, different nations have to come up with their own. It's not enough and not possible for any one group or country to say, here it is, just do it. And I think maybe the analogy that might be helpful here is cooking. And that you know, the important thing is to kind of identify some good ingredients. And it seems like most places have one, but not, or two, but not a whole bunch of them. But you know, ingredients like, you know, strong youth leadership projects would get people involved, young people involved in leadership roles in public life, or communities that have strong traditions and capacity to do the kind of deliberative processes that we've been talking about. Or another ingredient might be a thriving local online community where people are doing some of this. So there could be, you know, I'm just listing some of the ones that come to my mind, but different people might have other lists. But if you kind of say, here, look at some examples of cool things that are working in different places, different parts of the world, and you, in your community, you look at that kind of list, think about what you've got already, other things you might bring in from other places, but above all, make that list of ingredients into a recipe, into a long-term plan for civic engagement and local democracy. And if we can kind of encourage people to be chefs in that way, that would be a big shift that would be, I think, really helpful.
Thanks. We've run over time, and just my concluding comment in relation to what Lucas said is that whatever decision we make about a model, it needs to come through a public deliberation from my point of view. So, I think that's some of the stuff that New Democracy's been doing really well, and I hope we continue to do that. Thank you very much for your patience. We did go a little bit over time, and for your fantastic participation as well as an audience. So if you're interested in any of this, New Democracy has links. Anyone on this panel has a website. My own is Active Democracy. I just encourage you to explore some of these ideas more and keep talking to us and to each other. Thank you very much. Sure.